Welcome back to my channel, everybody. This video is for Pearson 2.0 for English Language GCSE. And I'm looking at the differences between implicit and explicit information. And this video really is aimed at Paper 1 questions 4A and 4B, which are two questions in that first paper which have 2 marks each. So we're not here talking about lots and lots of marks. These are very small marks, or very small questions in terms of marks, but every mark helps. And because these questions are low in marks, they're supposed to be a bit simpler compared to longer questions or questions which have more marks. So ideally, we want students to obviously get them right. There can be some confusion between implicit and explicit information. So the main aim of this video, I suppose, is to show you the difference between the two and what each of these questions requires from you in that Paper 1 exam. In this video, I'm going to be using pictures, and then I'm going to be using text later. So we're going to start with pictures, and I always start with pictures to practice implicit and explicit information, because pictures maybe are something that we're more familiar with. So when we look at the dictionary definition of explicit, it means something that is stated directly and clearly. And because it's stated in that way, there is no reason for doubt or confusion. So it's very, very clear to us. So we have here a picture of an ambulance. And I'm sure this isn't the first time that you've seen an ambulance. So if we are going to be writing 4 points about this ambulance based on what the evidence shows us, based on what the picture shows us, this is facts, of course, about the ambulance underneath. So this is an ambulance. The ambulance is a type of vehicle. It's green and yellow, and it has wheels. That's all explicit information based on what we see from this image. Okay, and there's no cause for doubt there. There's no cause for confusion. It's exactly what we see, and therefore that is practicing our ability to make points about explicit information. Implicit is probably the trickier skill, because this is more to do with what is suggested by the evidence rather than being directly expressed by it. So again, let's look at the same image of the ambulance. The points now underneath this image of the ambulance are all things that we work out for ourselves. None of these points is mentioned in this image, for example. It's stuff that we know based on life experience, and it's inference. So these are all inferences that we make about the ambulance. So the ambulance helps people, it moves quickly, it's driven by paramedics, it saves people's lives, it takes people to hospital, and so on. There are probably other points as well. But none of those points are things that we are told explicitly by the image. Those are things that we work out for ourselves based on looking at the evidence and making logical interpretations or inferences. So let's again practice the difference between explicit and implicit by looking at this image. This image was in the media about a decade ago now, and I've always used it really to practice making inferences. You can pause the video now to write down some explicit information that you get told by this information, by this picture, or you can write down what you work out from this image implicitly. If not, you can carry on watching the video and we can go through some possible answers. So in the top box, this kind of turquoisey pale blue box, we have some explicit information. So based on what we can see in the image, basically listing everything that we can see. So there are people on scene, police on scene, people are watching, this is happening on a street, there's a man in the road, it's nighttime, there's graffiti on the wall, there's a Greggs in the background, and there are cars. That's all explicit information. That's based on what we can see for ourselves clearly and directly from the picture. Implicitly, though, takes us a bit of thinking, because we've got to look at this evidence and work out things based on what the evidence shows us. So it's Christmas time. We can make that interpretation because there are Christmas lights hanging in the what looks like a shopping centre in the background. So we know that when we see fairy lights like that, it must be Christmas time. It's cold. We know that because people are wearing coats. The man in the road is drunk. We know that because firstly, he's reaching for a bottle of lager. And secondly, it's unusual and not normal behaviour to lie in the street like that. The police, it seems, are arresting a man. We can't see any handcuffs, but when we see police kind of pinning somebody down like that, it's probably to restrain them, to put handcuffs on them. It's been raining. We know that because the ground's wet. There's been a fight maybe between these two gentlemen, and that's why the police are arresting someone for an assault. Those cars could be taxis, because we know that when cars line up like that outside maybe a club or a bar, it's because people have drunk too much to drive home themselves and they're being picked up by an Uber or a taxi. And in this situation, because we know what the police represent, just in society generally, we probably make the inference that in this situation, the police have the most authority out of all of these people. So in that dark blue box there, those are all implicit points. We're not told any of this directly or explicitly, but it's things that we can work out for ourselves based on what we see. So we're interpreting the evidence here, we're making inferences. And again, this is the difference between questions 4a and 4b. The explicit information would be 4a, the implicit information would be 4b. The final image I want to show you is a bit of a different image. This time it's of somebody's bedroom. And again, you can pause this image now to write down a list of things of what is explicit and write down a list of things that are implicit, or you can carry on watching and I can go through some of the possible answers. So here, explicitly, you're basically listing what you can see. There's a bed, there's a window and a blind, there are 3 guitars, it's dark outside, there are rosettes on the wall, there's a rucksack, clothes on the floor, and photos on the notice board. So that's all explicit. It's what we can see based on seeing and looking at the evidence. Implicitly, though, takes a bit of thinking. We've got to look at this room and make interpretations about perhaps the person that owns this room. So these points here are all things that we work out for ourselves based on looking at the evidence. So we make the conclusion probably that this room belongs to a girl or to a female because of the colour of the room. No offence, lads, if your room is this colour, but it's not usually a colour that that boys have as their bedroom. We might also make the inference that this room belongs to a teenager based on kind of just the decor and what we can see in the room, the objects in the room. There's 3 guitars, so we make the conclusion that this person that owns this room plays instruments and are quite talented musically. We could make the interpretation that this room belongs to a student because that rucksack might be used for taking to college or school with books inside. And if they're a teenager, they'll probably be in some kind of education. We make the conclusion that the room's owner is sporty and competitive because of those rosettes, and we know that you only win a rosette once you've won something, so you have to take part in a competition. We might suggest that the owner of the room is messy because the clothes are just littered in the floor and the bed is unmade, so it's not particularly tidy. And we might also make the inference, based on the evidence, that the person that owns this room is a creative person because they've got what looks like sketchbooks on the floor with stickers on them next to the guitar. And there's also photographs on the notice board which they might have taken, suggesting a degree of artistic talent maybe. So in the dark blue box here, we have our interpretations of the evidence, things that we're not told explicitly or directly by the evidence, but things that we can work out for ourselves. So I've always used images to practice the difference between implicit and explicit information. So linking then to paper 1, this is essentially what 4a and 4b are assessing, your ability to write down facts based on what the text directly tells you explicitly in 4a, but then also to look at an extract and be able to make inferences. In other words, what is suggested to you, and that's 4b. And I think in my experience, students always tend to get 4B confused. There tends to be no problems with 4A, but it's 4B, the implicit side of things, that students tend to struggle more with. So hopefully using images will have helped you see the difference. So let's begin to look at texts. So I've got numerous texts to help with this. Always a good idea to read the question before you read the extract. So let's look at 4A first. Identify 2 things about the apple. After the bleeding stopped and I had located a plaster for the offending wound, I managed to peel the apple after it had been washed and grass removed from its tough exterior. I hadn't eaten since breakfast and my stomach was grumbling. Having bit into the green fruit, my eyes watered and my mouth caved in on itself, and I discarded it into the nearest bin. So in order to answer 4A, you need to write down 2 facts that you learn about the apple, 2 things that you're told explicitly. For 4B, using that same extract, you're identifying 2 things that tell us that the man's experience with this fruit was unpleasant. So 2 things that we're told that would suggest that this experience with the apple has not been entirely pleasant for this gentleman. Again, you can pause video now and have a go at answering this, or you can carry on watching and we can go through some answers. So for 4A, it had tough skin and the apple was green. Those are 2 explicit facts that we learn about the apple based on the evidence that we're given. So hopefully no issues there. 4B, we have to write a little bit more because we have to show the examiner that we are interpreting the evidence and making inferences. So the first thing we're told is the man was bleeding, and that suggests perhaps that he had cut himself by trying to peel the apple. So that is unpleasant because nobody likes to cut themselves while peeling something that they're going to eat. The second thing that suggests that this man's experience with the apple was unpleasant is the fact that it tasted horrible. It was very, very sour, because we know that when you eat something and your eyes water or your mouth caves in, it suggests that the taste of the apple is far too sour for us to enjoy, and we spit it out and we throw it away. And that, again, the second point there, which suggests that the man's experience with the apple was very unpleasant. Notice in some of them I'm quoting, but I'm quoting very short quotes, as is always the case. But I'm also in 4B making sure that I really show the examiner that I can interpret this information for myself without having to be spoon-fed information from the examiner. So that's one example of the differences between 4A and 4B. Let's now look at a 19th century text, so a Victorian text. And this is practicing 4A. And we know, and you might know already, based on practicing this, that Victorian writers often loved their long, complex sentences, which can be a little bit off-putting. But remember, for 4A, we just need to select 2 bits of information, and that information can be very short. So from lines 10 to 19, which is what we've got here, identify 2 things that spectators in the crowd did. So there's quite a rowdy crowd here. We've got to list down 2 things that the people in the crowd did. When I came upon the scene at midnight, the shrillness of the cries and howls that were raised from time to time made my blood run cold. When the day dawned, thieves, low prostitutes, ruffians and vagabonds of every kind flocked on the ground, with every variety of offensive and foul behaviour. Fightings, faintings, whistlings, brutal jokes, disorderly demonstrations of indecent delight, when swooning women were dragged out of the crowd by the police, with their dresses disordered, gave a new zest to the general entertainment. When the sun rose brightly, it shone upon thousands of upturned faces, so inexpressibly odious in their brutal mirth of callousness, that a man had cause to feel ashamed of the shape he wore, and to shrink from himself as fashioned in the image of the devil. So don't get put off by the kind of the tone, or the dense description. But you're looking very carefully for just 2 very simple facts about what the people in this crowd did. So you can pause now and write them down, or you can carry on watching for the answers. And we've got certainly more than 2 answers here that would count. So we've got on this page, how many? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 possible answers here from this text, and I've highlighted them in yellow. So 2 answers could be they fainted and there were fights. But you could also write down that people flocked onto the ground, the women were swooning, or some women were swooning. The spectators let out shrill cries and howls. There were unkind jokes made, and they were generally acting in an offensive manner, as suggested by the evidence I've highlighted in yellow. So those are all explicit points based on the evidence that we read. That is what the text tells us clearly and directly, if you remember right back at the beginning when we were talking about the dictionary definition. Like I said, the challenge often comes with 4B. Even though this is still 2 marks, some students are still a bit confused sometimes between the differences between these 2 questions. So for 4B, the question is a bit more focused. Identify 2 things that tell us that the spectators did not feel pity towards the criminals who were executed. Okay, so this is the question, and we've got to again read this time a shorter extract and find 2 answers that tell us that the spectators did not feel pity and what their actions suggest to us about how they felt. So we've got that first paragraph, which is the same as the last question, but now they've put in the second paragraph. When the 2 miserable criminals who attracted all of this ghastly sight about them were turned into the air, there was no more emotion, no more restraint in any of the previous obscenities than if the name of Christ had never been heard in this world. And there were no belief among men, but that they perished like the beasts. So this could be some kind of public hanging, let's say, or a situation where criminals get their comeuppance in some way because those criminals had done the wrong thing, perhaps. So we're trying to find 2 bits of information that we could interpret in terms of proving that these spectators did not feel sympathy towards these 2 criminals who were about to be executed. So again, you can pause the video now, or you can carry on watching for some possible answers. Again, I've highlighted some possible answers here in yellow. All of these yellow points are things which we could interpret using the word suggesting or suggests. So the phrase brutal mirth suggests that the crowd found the execution entertaining and humorous. Mirth means happiness, laughter, celebration almost. So it's almost as if these spectators were taking delight in seeing the execution of these 2 criminals. The second point could be the crowd felt no more emotion, suggesting they didn't feel sympathy for the criminals. They had absolutely no pity for them at all and viewed them as almost like animals. 2 other answers could be in the box there on the right hand side. The crowd's behaviour did not change during the execution, so they had no more restraint in any of the previous obscenities, meaning that they just continued to act as they always had done, even when the 2 criminals were brought out to be executed. And finally, another possible answer could be that these criminals were believed to be beasts. And what you want to do, of course, with sinister beasts is you want to kind of eradicate them so they don't cause any more problems. So the crowd thought the criminals would perish like beasts, suggesting they thought them as evil and damned. And that's why they want them gone. So the difference then with 4B, whereas 4A is to do with some explicit details that we're told directly and clearly from the extract, 4B means we need to take some evidence and interpret it for ourselves, as I have done on this slide. So that is the difference. And if students aren't careful, they can end up just writing the answers to 4A again. There's a difference here. So with 4B, because that's one that students tend to get confused with, you need to find evidence that proves the statement is correct, but then interpret that evidence for yourself. In other words, what does that evidence suggest to me about whatever it is you're being asked in the question? So hopefully that video has been useful in helping you see the difference between implicit and explicit information, and also the differences for the Pearson 2.0 course for English language, and the differences between questions 4A and 4B for paper 1. Thank you very much for watching, and good luck in your studies.